there is a God in the universe. Does the idea of God fill you with fear this morning? Does it scare you that there's an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent being out there who answers to no one but himself, who has absolute power? Who's to judge him? Who's to say whether he's right or wrong? By what criteria need he be moral? Who's to stop him? Does he scare you this morning? You see, Job found himself in a situation in which he was completely blown away because the situation was unintelligible to him, and it seemed in his mind completely unjustified. Job had served God all of his life. God himself in the first chapter of Job says that Job was holy and blameless. Unlike anyone on the face of the planet, he feared God and shunned evil. This guy, when you get that kind of a compliment from God, that's pretty good. Nevertheless, Job finds himself in a situation in which all of his children have been killed by a freak accident. All of them. His crops have been raided and burned by his enemies. His animals all stolen and killed. And he himself stricken with an awful disease that leaves him completely incapacitated, laying in the dirt, covered with boils. And his own wife looks at him and says, "Will you just curse God and die?" Now, throughout the book of Job, Job asks one simple question. Why? What have I done? How is this just? How is this fair? And perhaps much to our surprise, he gets an answer. But it's not the answer he wanted to hear. And that answer is found for us in Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footing set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no farther? Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Isn't that an appropriate response for God? Who are we to say what is right when it comes to him? Who are we to say what's the proper thing to do? He is the ultimate authority and creator of all things. He is God. No matter what kind of God he is. The fear of the Lord, the fear of his power, the fear of what he can do and has the right to do is the beginning of wisdom. But the glory for us is not the God he has the right to be, but the God he turned out to be. He turned out to be concerned for us. Didn't have to be. We're dust. We're dirt. We're created things. But he turned out to be concerned when he created Adam in the garden. He didn't like the fact that Adam was alone. It concerned him. So he made a helper suitable to him, that he might become a community and not be lonely. He's not only concerned with our contentment, but with our happiness. That's who he turned out to be. But there's no reason he should be that way. He turned out to be merciful. He turned out to forgive us for the most immense sins. He turned out to love us to the point that he would hold off wrath and judgment just to see us get another chance. He turned out to be merciful. He turned out to be unbelievably patient. When his people rejected him over hundreds, if not thousands of years, generation after generation, despite the miracles, despite his intervening work on their behalf, despite the fact that they saw the sea split in two, despite the fact that they saw the pillar of fire, despite the fact that they watched fire fall on Mount Carmel and consume the sacrifices, it was never enough. But he was patient, never forsaking. And that patience also shows us his faithfulness, regardless of how unfaithful we are. This is the God he turned out to be. Does it astound you today? He's the all-powerful God. He answers to no one. Why would he be patient with dirt that refuses to obey? But all that's great. Here's the surprise. He is not a God, as Job thought he might be, who sits above our sufferings in judgment over us. He himself became flesh and suffered under the same curse that we chose. John Stott, in his book, The Cross of Christ, explained this realization of God's character this way. I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time after a while, I've had to turn away. And in imagination, I've turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. There is still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross which symbolizes divine suffering. The cross of Christ is God's only self-justification in a world such as ours. There's a difference between serving him and loving him, isn't there? And that's what we know. You see, I serve him because he's God. But that's not why I love him. I love him today because of the God he turned out to be. This is the God that cries out to us today. Can you hear him? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 21 through 6:2 say it this way. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. As God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. He who knew no sin became sin for us. You see, we serve a God that when you show him your pain, when you show him your heartache, when you show him your suffering, he shows you his lacerated back, his nail-scarred hands and feet, the spear hole in his side, the thorn scars on his brow, and the deep internal anguish of a man who watched the people he came to die for spit on him, ridicule him, reject him, and ultimately cry, "Crucify him." Edward Shillito penned the poem Jesus of the Scars just after World War I. It says this, "If we have never sought, we seek thee now. Thine eyes burn through the dark, our only stars. We must have sight of thorn marks on thy brow. We must have thee, O Jesus of the scars. The heavens frighten us, they're too calm. In all the universe we have no place. Our wounds are hurting us. Where is the balm? Lord Jesus, by thy scars we know thy grace. If when the doors are shut thou drawest near, only reveal those hands, that side of thine. We know today what wounds are, have no fear. Show us thy scars. We know the countersign." Now hear this. "The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds only God's wounds can speak. And not a god has wounds, but thou alone." Have you heard him calling from the cross this morning? Not above our suffering, but in the midst of it. Do you hear his cry today?